It was June 4th, 1943, on Railroad Street in Mexia, Texas. Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt's pencil trembled slightly as he recorded a truth that, if discovered by his own officers, would have earned him solitary confinement. He wrote, "The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts." Through the train window, he had just witnessed something that directly contradicted 3 years of constant Nazi propaganda. Electric lights blazed from every farmhouse, every street corner, and every shop window, an endless constellation of electricity stretching across the Texas plains at 10 o'clock at night. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification reached barely 20% of German farms. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda had described as a decadent, collapsed America, electricity flowed like water. 1,850 veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped down from a passenger train, not the usual cramped cattle cars or freight wagons, but cushioned Pullman coaches with dining services and sleeping berths. The entire population of Mexia had turned out to witness their arrival. What none of them knew was that this moment would trigger the most profound psychological transformation in modern prisoner of war history, a systematic demolition of Nazi ideology through the sheer display of American industrial capacity. The mathematics of Allied victory were being written not in battle plans, but in production statistics that would soon shatter every assumption these soldiers carried about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. The collapse of the Afrika Korps had begun on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, surrendered along with approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. These were the Wehrmacht's most experienced desert fighters, men who had driven the British back to Egypt and had earned the grudging respect of Montgomery himself, and now they were suddenly prisoners. Among them was Hedman Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, a veteran of the France campaign, and wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later in the National Archives, would provide historians with the most detailed account of the psychological impact of American captivity on German soldiers. The journey from defeat to revelation began in the port of Oran, Algeria. As Radke and 30,000 other prisoners of war waited in makeshift camps for transport ships, American efficiency was already beginning to crack their preconceptions. The U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners daily with an organizational precision that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved even at the height of its power. Identity cards were photographed and filed. Medical examinations were completed. Inoculations were administered. Geneva Convention rights were explained in fluent German by American officers who had been trained specifically for this moment. But the first real shock came with the food. Obergefreiter Hans Moller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later, saying that in the cage at Oran, while they waited for ships, the Americans fed them better than they had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. They initially thought it was a temporary propaganda effort designed to impress them. They didn't realize this was just the standard U.S. military ration. The Liberty ships that would carry them across the Atlantic were in themselves monuments to American industrial capacity. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in only 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. This was a fact that would have been dismissed as impossible propaganda if the Germans had known it. These massive cargo vessels, produced at a rate of 3 per day at the peak of production, were returning from delivering supplies to the European theater. Rather than sailing back empty, they carried human cargo. Up to 30,000 prisoners of war per month. The North Atlantic voyage, a route that German U-boats had recently dominated, was now a mere commuter run. They were met with the sight of a ceaseless conveyor belt of U.S. naval power. A vast convoy system, where only a few years prior the U-boats reigned supreme, was now an unassailable highway. The journey concluded at ports like Newport News, Virginia. It was here, as they disembarked, that the second, greater shockwave hit. As they were marched off the docks, they were met by what appeared to be an unending flow of military hardware. Hedman Friedrich Radke wrote, "As far as the eye could see, there was a steady stream of lorries, tanks, and trucks, all new, all coming from what seemed like an endless factory line. In 1943, the United States was producing one new warship per day, 1,000 tanks per week, and was turning out 96,000 military aircraft annually. America's oil wells produced 4.2 million barrels of oil daily, compared to the Reich's entire wartime supply of only 100,000 barrels. The German soldiers, who had been taught to revere the superiority of German engineering and manpower, watched this relentless, almost casual flood of material wealth and realized the war was truly unwinnable. Germany was running on fumes. America was drowning in abundance. The prisoners were then transported by rail to one of the 155 main base camps established across the country, mostly in the South and Midwest. The train ride itself was a psychological weapon. They passed through sprawling cities where every street was lit, across endless fields being harvested by new, enormous tractors, and past homes with electric refrigerators and cars parked in every driveway. This was the decadent America their leaders had ridiculed, a land of overwhelming, incomprehensible wealth. The largest of the camps was at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, which held 6,500 prisoners of war. Life in the camps was governed by the Geneva Convention, which ensured decent living conditions. The Germans lived in new, comfortable barracks, often better quality than the huts used by American enlisted men, and they received the same rations as U.S. troops, costing the government 48 cents per day. They even had their own newspaper, Der Ruf, The Call, published by a German prisoner of war in the camp, with articles on sports, culture, and life in the United States. In a stark contrast to the conditions in Soviet captivity, German prisoners in America could earn an additional 80 cents per day by working. The total number of prisoners of war in the U.S. eventually reached 425,000. By 1945, over 375,000 of them were working in 1,200 branch camps, primarily filling labor shortages in agriculture. They picked cotton and corn, harvested sugar beets, and worked in canning factories. This was perhaps the most crucial part of their indoctrination. American farmers often gave their workers better meals than the army provided, offering them fresh-baked goods, eggs, and all the milk they could drink. The farmers treated them not as subhuman enemies, but as fellow laborers, a level of basic human decency that baffled the men steeped in Nazi racial ideology. The prisoners were also given access to American culture. They could attend segregated, second-run cinemas to watch American movies, listen to American radio, and read American newspapers. Many took English classes, learning about the U.S. government and political system. They saw movies showing the horrors of Nazi concentration camps, undeniable documentary evidence that shattered their last defense of denial. It became impossible to reconcile the friendly, abundant reality of America with the grotesque enemy their propaganda had created. The Germans who arrived as ardent Nazi youth left as what historians call Demokratische Lagerleiter, democratic camp leaders, a clandestine program called the Re-Education Project, or sometimes the Intellectual Diversion Program, selected prisoners who showed potential and immersed them in democratic literature, films, and political discussion. These men, once re-educated, were then repatriated to Germany after the war. When the war ended, the majority of the prisoners of war were not sent directly home, but were transferred to U.S. camps in France and Belgium to help with reconstruction. However, they would never forget what they had seen in America. They had witnessed the true source of American power, not just military might, but the economic and moral strength of a free society. They returned to their homeland as unwitting ambassadors of democracy, carrying back the seeds of transformation that would bloom into one of history's most successful reconstructions. Their children would grow up in a democratic Germany, one that was allied with the United States, a partnership built on the transformation that began when 1,850 Africa Corps veterans stepped off a train in Mexia, Texas,
and discovered that everything they believed was wrong. The story of the German prisoners of war in America is a story of redemption through revelation. It proves that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through demonstration. Not through propaganda, but through prosperity. Not through hatred, but through humanity. The simple power of example was America's secret weapon. The German prisoners were stunned by America's industrial might, but more importantly, they were changed by it. And in that change lay the foundation for a better world.